Today's speaker is Jesse Morin. He's a practicing archaeologist that primarily worked for First Nations and with First Nations in British Columbia, including the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, the Comox First Nation up on eastern Vancouver Island, and the Takla Nation north of Prince George. He holds a PhD from anthropology here at UBC, and he is a specialist in tools, including stone tools, trade and exchange in British Columbia, and also in the prehistory of the Salish people. He works for First Nation compiling evidence of Aboriginal rights and title, which is then used in treaty negotiations and also in consultations related to major infrastructure projects. You can think Trans Mountain Pipeline as an example. And this research is interesting because it inverts the traditional research structure and it places the indigenous groups as the drivers of research into their history and culture. So he also works with First Nations managing ongoing impacts to cultural heritage sites and repatriation efforts. And I've had the pleasure of working with Jesse for some years now as part of a co-defined research project really led by Tsleil-Waututh, initiated and led by Tsleil-Waututh, where we are evaluating how the marine productivity of our backyard, Burrard Inlet or Tsleil-Waututh, has changed since colonization and what the consequences are of that in providing seafood for Tsleil-Waututh Nation. And it's significant, major changes, especially in the tidal zone. That's what happens when you build a big city right in a food producing area. Finally, I would also like to welcome Jesse as our newest adjunct professor. And with that, there's a resource for graduate students in the years to come. That's something I very much appreciate, as does Andrea Reed and Diane Newell, who look forward to working with Jesse in connection with the Center for Indigenous Fisheries. So, Jesse, welcome, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Billy. Can everybody hear me?
Very well.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to bring up my presentation from the beginning. And I'm taking everybody can see this first slide here. You know, my talk today is titled New Insights into Pre-Contact Coast-Salish Salmon Fisheries Management and Implications for Modern Stewardship. And so I'm starting here with a slide of the Courtney River right in front of my house. And we see these stakes, these wooden remains of fish traps embedded in the river. We see a couple hundred in front of me here. There are approximately 200,000 in the Comox Harbor of these wooden stakes preserved that we know of. And I'm drawing this folks' attention to this because we're talking a lot about fish traps and the importance of these traps that are located close to communities who can monitor and year after year track these changes in these populations. You'll see this constant monitoring, a key theme in my research. So by way of background as to who I am, I'll admit that I am not what I would consider a fisheries archaeologist. My dissertation was in stone tools, and I consider myself a specialist in that sort of realm. But here I am presenting at an Institute of Oceans and Fisheries, and why is that? How is that? I would say that I've sort of become an evolved archaeologist because of my nature of my work working for First Nations clients. You know, rather than being in this academic-driven setting where I am pursuing my own research agendas. Instead, I work with First Nations clients pursuing their research agendas, you know, in relation to treaty, in relation to major research, or major infrastructure development, in relation to ongoing management of their culture, history. This stuff is in the news all the time. You know, First Nations recognize their clear relationship and ancestry materials around them and in the ground, and they take that very, very seriously, much more seriously than our provincial government does. And so folks like me work with these First Nations, and rather than our research agendas driving the process, the First Nations research agenda drives these processes. And so I work for 3 major nations here and a couple of other clients, Tsleil-Waututh and Comox and Takla as well too. And I'm going to present with you two research topics, one from Comox here on Vancouver Island, and one from Tsleil-Waututh, closer to your neck of the woods. And it's I've become this evolved archaeologist, moving from a stone tool specialist. Why? Because this stuff is important to my clients, right? My clients are occasionally interested in stone tools and that side of the archaeology as well. But every time I turn around, fish is important, right? Fish is important to my clients. It was important to their ancestors. It continues to be important to them today. It's important with Aboriginal rights and title. It's important with treaty. And so me as an archaeologist working for First Nation clients, I've sort of become this fisheries archaeologist. And so that's how I've got here, and that's where we're going. So in terms of study area, I'm located here in Comox, in the unceded territory of the Comox people, also the most beautiful place in Canada. The research tour that I'm going to be taking you on is going to start up at Tsleil-Waututh there at the southern tip of Cape Mudge. We're going to talk about some ethnohistoric evidence of Comox fisheries. Then I'm going to be moving down to Comox, our place properly known as Pentlatch. And we're going to be talking about the excavation and analysis of these major fish trap panel that was associated with a large fish trap complex. And then about halfway through the presentation, we're going to shift back towards your neck of the woods, UBC at Ilkson there, and then more specifically within Burrard Inlet and Tsleil-Waututh. And we're going to be reviewing some DNA analyses of archaeological remains of salmonids to understand in more detail how Tsleil-Waututh's ancestors harvested resources and managed them. So first moving east and north from you guys to where I am, here we are at Cape Mudge. I'm showing you an image here that I'm not sure if the color version has ever been published, but this is a watercolor based on a sketch drafted by a midshipman on George Vancouver's expedition in 1792. So this image is sort of documenting that moment of first contact, the first time Europeans ran into Comox people here at the northern tip of, at the southern tip of Quadra Island, here at the northern edge of the Salish Sea. And so just at the glance at this image, we see a cluster of large plank houses up on top of bluff. We see canoes in the front, and we see some other features. We have this beautiful image that was drafted here, first in a sketch and then in a watercolor. And then we have the verbatim accounts of George Vancouver, who spent an afternoon here, along with Archibald Menzies, who had lunch with the chiefs here and traveled through this village on July 13th of 1792. And so I'm going to explore a couple details of this image as a way of introduction to the sort of fisheries that I'm talking about. So I'm going to zoom in on little aspects of this image here. So here I've zoomed in on this little thing on the lower left. We can see some Europeans coming ashore here to visit our Comox friends here. We can see a Comox guy holding a stick over his shoulders with some salmon-sized fish on it. I've talked to Comox fishermen and they're quite certain that people will be fishing bluebacks at this point in time. So young coho apparently cruise right through this area. In July, that's when the bluebacks come through. So in our minds, there's no doubt that these people are fishing bluebacks here at Tsleil-Waututh. We're zooming in now. We're going to zoom in right on the houses themselves, and we see these big plank houses. It sort of looks like they're drying their laundry on lines above those plank houses, but I'm certain that's not laundry. Those are fish. So Tsleil-Waututh, there's not a lot of flat ground here, right? So to compensate for the lack of flat ground, people have built these fish drying racks up on top of their houses to catch that warm breeze to sort of dry it out. So I've marked these fish racks with the black arrows there, and then on the red arrow, I'm identifying this large net. It's a little bit globby. It's hard to tell what it is, but we can be quite certain it's net because Archibald Menzies described nets drying in front of these houses in 1792. So we've got salmon-sized fish drying on top of the roofs, and we've got a salmon net drying in front of these roofs. And I failed to mention at the outset here, but this is one of the richest salmon fisheries in the entire world. So there's no doubt that Comox people were here fishing salmon in the middle of the summer in 1792, and no doubt had been doing so for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So now I'm going to zoom into another feature on the bottom right-hand corner here. So we can see this fence-like structure running into the intertidal zone. Now, this isn't commented on in any way by Menzies or Vancouver or any other party aboard that expedition. But to my knowledge, this is quite clearly a wooden fence in the intertidal area, and we know these functioned as fish traps. So to my knowledge, this might be the earliest description of a wooden fish trap in the Pacific Northwest. And to my knowledge, no one else has ever noted this feature in this image before. So I want you to bear in mind this image of a wooden fence extending into the intertidal. It's going to be directly relevant to virtually everything else I speak about now. So now I'm going to swing us south from Tsleil-Waututh down to Pentlatch. So now I'm in Comox Harbor, which is named after the Comox people who relocated here from Tsleil-Waututh around 1850 because of intense warfare. So in Comox Harbor, we have what may be the largest and most extensive set of wooden fish traps in North America. Perhaps beyond that, it's sort of hard to scale these things. The two images below are just snapshots of the remains of these fish traps. So we see these little wooden stubs of stakes sticking out of the muck there. We know from some complete examples of these stakes, these are about 2.5 meters long. And they didn't consist of a branch or a split piece of wood. Each of these wooden stakes consists of a 12 to 15-year-old Douglas fir tree. And there are approximately 200,000 of these hammered into the mud flats here. And so these stake alignments are up to 300 meters long. They're very extensive. Some of them consist of thousands of individual stakes. And these have been studied in some detail by Nancy Green and colleagues. She's mapped them in detail using total stations. And she's extracted, I think, 80 radiocarbon dates from a whole number of these fish traps to develop a long sequence of use and occupation. And these traps all in the harbor today date from about 1300 BP to 100 BP, or say 800 AD until 1850 or so. So if we look at a schematic and some of the maps of what these fish traps look like, there's a long leader, a long fence-like element that draws the fish into these enclosures. And we have two major styles of these traps in Comox Harbor. We have what Nancy calls the winged heart fish trap, which you'll see on the upper image on your right, and then the winged chevron fish trap. And these are two very different styles. The winged heart type are earlier, and then abruptly at about 700 BP, they stop making them in that style and they start making them exclusively in the winged chevron trap style. And Nancy's hypothesis is that this shift in fish trap form is associated with the targeting of different species. And her hypothesis is these earlier traps were targeting herring, and these later, more recent traps rather, are targeting salmon. And she's hypothesizing that there's the ecological shifts to do with the Little Ice Age triggered sort of ecological regime changes and decreased the number of herring and increased the number of salmon. So that's the hypothesis. The data is clearly there that we have this remarkable shift in trap styles. And really up to this point, all we understand of these traps is that they exist of these wooden stakes driven into the mud. We don't really know what was attached to them until we get to this point. And so we're moving forward here. And Nancy published that material in 2015. In 2017, she raised a very specific issue to me and to KFN with the discovery she had made on the banks of the Courtney River. She regularly walks this river in the harbor looking for new discoveries. And in April of 2017, perhaps after a bit of a storm, she identified what she thought was part of a lattice panel or some sort of meshing that was eroding out of the riverbank here that would have been attached to these fish traps. And this is the first one we've ever seen. And so you can see there, we've done a little bit of exploratory water excavation to expose some of these elements to try to identify what this is that we are looking at. So I'm gonna move forward here. So on-site meetings with Chief, I'm going to back up. This is Chief Nicole Rempel here in the green shirt, and we've got Corey Frank, so Comox individuals here, telling us what they want to do, right? So the decision is made by Comox Chief and Council that this is a one-off, it's highly significant, and provides unique insight into KFN history. So the decision is made to excavate, well, preserve it for now, excavate it to the best we can, and then preserve it indefinitely. So at that time in April, we covered it up with landscape fabric and some sandbags just to keep it protected, and then planned a future full-scale excavation of this panel. And so here we see this panel, it's in its entirety. It's approximately 6 meters long, consisting of these long kindling-like pieces of strips of wood running parallel together with some cross elements that it's bound to, and some twine-like elements that ties all these things together. And to our knowledge, this is the largest and perhaps most complete example of these features in the Pacific Northwest. And I want to draw people's attention to this image on my bottom here. We can see two KFN Guardian Watchmen uncovering this panel in August. It's been perfectly protected for those summer months. And again, we can see all those fish trap stakes in the immediate background. So for us as archaeologists, as we're excavating this, there's no uncertainty as to what this is, right? It's in and amongst fish traps on the bank of a major salmon river. So moving forward, as we expose this thing, it's highly delicate. You know, it's got the texture of sort of wet cardboard. We're exposing the elements as lightly as we can using low pressure water hoses. And just to draw your attention, to this one image at the top here, we can see that these long parallel lathes are attached to a rigid upright lathe. This is unusual in the Pacific Northwest. Almost all of the other examples that we have are simply bound with twine or root, some sort of element that I've highlighted here. But this one is meant to be rigid as well. So perhaps designed to withstand additional force of the tides or the shore or what have you, but a different type of technological construction than we've seen before. And so how are these things attached here? We've got one example of the lattice there, and you can see the twining between the individual elements. And if you look near the bottom of that panel, you can see very heavy wear marks on those long lattice pieces. And our interpretation is that is where this panel was bound to the stakes that would have held it upright within the harbor. We've got a good number of examples of these stakes that we've extracted from here or there. And the example that I show you right there shows these binding elements, how they were wrapped around this wooden stake, and how through friction with just the waves and the tides would have slowly worn that away. And so we're quite certain that these panels were attached to these wooden fish traps. And from our back of the envelope calculations, it would require at least 80 of these panels to construct or to attach to one fish trap to make it functional. So we need to be thinking large scale here. So just as some examples of what these things would have looked like ethnographically, these are from farther south in the Coast Salish area, and these are river spanning weirs on the Cowichan River. And so we can see something, a sort of a similar arrangement. We've got a wooden pole structure, sort of as the skeleton of this trap complex, and then a whole series of these lattice panels attached to these skeleton panels. In this case, these Cowichan panels are entirely flexible. They're not held by these wooden cross pieces the way the Comox examples are. So in this case, these Cowichan ones could be bundled up into a nice bundle. You certainly can't do that with the Comox example. And so moving to analysis of this, I've got to pause for a second and say that this is not my own work entirely. This is part of a team effort, including staff from the RBCM, staff from Baseline Archaeology and IFLP Archaeology, who donated their time, and of course the KFN Guardian Watchmen. And so each part had their own little, each team part had our own little piece to take on of this work. The wood identification was undertaken by Dr. Ken Marr at RBCM. And now he identified that all these long lathes were Western hemlock, and then these perpendicular supporting pieces were Sitka spruce. And I mention this specifically because it was completely unanticipated. In my mind, there was no doubt that these things are all long pieces of split cedar, but I was not correct. I should note maybe that cedar is a little bit rare in the Comox Valley. We're in a little bit of a dry area and it does not survive well here. So it's possible that hemlock and Sitka spruce are used as in response to that scarcity, or it's possible that there is some specific attribute of this spruce and hemlock that makes it more resilient and better for these marine conditions. Certainly the people building these traps knew what they were doing. So I also note we've radiocarbon dated this panel. I took two separate samples from different weft elements, these tie elements, and both Both samples gave dates of about 560 BP and 550 BP. So we can be very, very confident that this panel was built and used around the 14th century, 15th century, somewhere around 1400. And perhaps a big storm or something knocked it off and just embedded it in the mud there and left it for us to find. So what have we learned about Coast Salish fisheries, about Comox fisheries from this panel? Well, we can say that it confirms to some degree Green's hypothesis, because the spacing between these individual lays is about 3.5 centimeters, right? So wide enough that herring could certainly pass through it, or smaller fish could, but definitely narrow enough that salmon would not pass through it. So in this regard, it confirms the idea that these traps, these more recent traps, were used for salmon. Now, it also identifies that this, because I think we can infer this, because people put so much effort into building these salmon traps for 6 centuries, including hundreds of thousands of stakes and hundreds of these panels, that people were very successful in sustainably harvesting this salmon. By my calculation, there are at least 8 pre-contact villages around Comox Harbor and Courtney River, and certainly the total population, the indigenous population, would have numbered in the low to mid thousands. And they're getting all of their food from right here. So certainly there's stability in those harvesting practices and the local availability. But the construction of these panels implies very, very strongly that it's local ownership and local modification. I find in talking to some people sort of casually, they have this idea that people could just float in canoes, set up a fish trap, harvest away, and then disappear into the sunset when they're done. I think this is a completely wrong way of looking at this. I think we need to consider these fish trap locations as places that are owned on the landscape by the chiefly pentlatch lineages, that they had specialists with the special knowledge of constructing and maintaining these panels, these fish traps, and would have disassembled these delicate lattice panels probably in the late fall after the chum have finished and before the strong winter storms pick up here. And so we can imagine probably whole houses half full of these panels in the winter months, and in the resident pentlatch population carefully managing these stocks as they see them day to day, twice a day as the tides rise and fall in these fish traps. And certainly outsiders would have been motivated to marry into these families to access these fish traps. So to me, the key feature here is that this is a stable fishery, it's technologically sophisticated, and people put enormous amounts of effort into maintaining access to these resources that are indeed right at the front door of Comox people. So now I'm going to take a sharp turn, I guess a turn to the right in this situation, and I'm going to bring this research back towards UBC at Ulkson there, and more specifically in Burrard Inlet or Tsleil-Waututh, in the home of the Tsleil-Waututh people. And so unlike the research that I presented previously, this was still in the works. This has just been accepted for publication and will all become very real shortly. But by way of background, this research is really focused at trying to gain greater resolution into early Tsleil-Waututh subsistence and into the ecology of Burrard Inlet. And so as archaeologists, we've been studying subsistence for a long time in this area. And we know since at least 3,500 years ago, the ancestors of the Coast Salish people had a sophisticated economy that was wholly focused on the marine resources, salmon, herring, shellfish, very specialized by this point in time early. We know these small fish were really important to past diets as well too. Herring, smelt, and anchovy were perhaps as important as salmon in total, but we're certain that salmon is very important. In early ethnohistoric estimates place, depending on where you are as a Coast Salish person, consumption estimates between 300 and 500 kilos per person per year. And so this is interesting. We know people are eating a lot of salmon, but as archaeologists, we can't visually distinguish the salmon remains, right? So we don't know whether it's a chum or a sockeye or a chinook. We just know it's salmon. But from an ecological perspective, all these salmon have very different characteristics, different spawning habitats, and different spawning timing. So as archaeologists, when we can distinguish the species of these salmonids from the remains, we can make far more insightful and detailed inferences about past behavior, past human behavior. So I'm relying on some genetic techniques here developed by Donya Yang and Tom Royal. And certainly Yang's lab, Donya's lab, has specialized in the identification and extraction of mitochondrial DNA from these salmons to identify the species. And more recently, Tom Royal, one of his students, has been able to identify the sex of salmon from mitochondrial DNA. So I'm going to be applying these two techniques to a broad inlet sample. And this study was, I've got to mention, part of a broader study focusing on Tsleil-Waututh subsistence, past resource use, and past ecology. And this aspect of this study was funded by the Port of Vancouver. They felt, or perhaps Tsleil-Waututh asked them nicely to provide some funding for this work, and they obliged. I put a shout out here to some of my collaborators, largely geneticists and a few other archaeologists thrown in there. I'm sorry if I've missed anyone. Certainly, I am not a geneticist, and I have not undertaken that side of the analysis. I select the samples and I do the research design. And so really what we're trying to here is to refine our current understandings of past subsistence, past ecology, landscape use, and seascape use. So zooming in on my study area here, this is Eastern Tsleil-Waututh, Burrard Inlet. The little triangles with those funny codes are archaeological sites. So we've got 5 significant archaeological sites within this area, probably all within 5 kilometers of one another. And I've extracted samples from these sites from previously excavated levels and layers, about 123 salmon remains, salmon vertebrae from these sites. These sites span a little bit more than, well, a little bit less than 2,000 years, from about 300 BC to AD 1500. All these sites are known to be ancestral Tsleil-Waututh village sites too. So they're not just archaeological sites, they're places where Tsleil-Waututh ancestors used to live. We've got Tsleil-Waututh names for them. We've got named Tsleil-Waututh ancestors who used to live there. In one case, we've got a whole Tsleil-Waututh community still living on top of the location. So they're not just archaeological sites, these are ancestral Tsleil-Waututh living places. And just maybe step back a little bit for those that aren't archaeologists, these shell middens, these archaeological sites around the inlet are all primarily shell middens built up of these layers of refuse through time, layers of shell, layers of salmon debris, tools that contain burials. But most importantly, they can be well dated and they preserve material really well. So I've showed a little snapshot here of a shell midden from Tsleil-Waututh's IR3, and we can see all these layers, radiocarbon dated to 3,000 years at the bottom and 400 years up at the top. And so we know the age of all these layers, so we can extract salmon bones from each of these layers and send them away and look at change through time. And that was one of the key aspects we wanted to look at here. So jumping into it, we've done our analyses on the 123 remains from these 5 sites. And what are the results? Well, the primary result is that chum dominates all times and all periods at all sites. The map to the right with the pie charts each pie represents the total sample from each site. And the proportions of the pie represent proportions of each species. And in this case, chum are that dark gray species, and we see chum dominating everything, at least 75%. Chum is common up in Indian Arm, immediately north of here, and it's well known to be the primary winter food for most Coast Salish people. The next most common species we have after chum is pink salmon, which runs in the summer and runs in abundance in Indian Arm and up Indian River. And then after that, we see a very small slice of sockeye, a very small slice of chinook, and a very small slice of coho. So sockeye and chinook are almost certainly taken from the Fraser River, about a 2-hour walk south of here, or about a 15-hour canoe ride around the way, as they don't come into the inlet very often. They don't spawn in these rivers. So the only time they'd come into the inlet are really as strays. And so if we look at these site assemblages as a total, we can say that they're pretty much the same, right? It's not like some of them are winter focused and some of them are summer focused. They all seem to have this fall winter focus based on these chum abundance. But chum are, of course, only one of the types of remains there, right? So the chum strongly indicates a fall winter occupation, right? You harvest them in the fall, you live off them on the fall, you smoke them, you bring them home in the winter, you live off them in the winter and into the spring. But if we look at the other fish coming from these sites, and I've summarized this in this little table below here, we've got a lot of small fish as well. We've got a lot of herring, and we've got a fair bit of ooligan. And we know herring spawn in the late winter and perhaps late spring, and hooligan spawn later on in the spring. So when we look at the other fish that are seasonally available in these same shellmitten sites, we have to recognize that there is clear evidence for spring occupation as well. And so if we've got some summer occupation, as evidenced by the sockeye and the pink, and we've got clear fall winter occupation evidenced by the chum, and then we've got spring occupation as evidenced by the herring and the hooligan, then really what we're talking about for these villages is year-round occupation. You know, as archaeologists, we always talk about winter village sites, but this evidence points to something quite a bit different, right? They might have been primarily occupied during the winter, but it certainly seems that some folks were here year-round all the time. So I think we need to start talking about village sites as permanent settlements, year-round settlements, rather than winter villages. Certainly, this is what the evidence shows for Burrard Inlet, and I suspect with more detailed analyses of other sites in other regions, we would have similar patterns. And so now I'm just going to focus even a little bit more narrow here. So now we're just looking at the chum remains from Burrard Inlet. We're looking at the same 5 sites, but now we've sexed these chum remains. So we've extracted the mitochondrial DNA from them, and we've identified which are the boys and which are the girls. And we would expect, if all things are equal and people are equally harvesting all chum, we'd get approximately a 1-to-1 sort of ratio or 50-50 sort of ratio. But that's not what we have. If we look at these 5 sites here, and we can ignore the one with the sample size of 1, but we can look at those other 4 sites with reasonable sample sizes. We have a marked bias towards male chum at one site in Port Moody there, with 7 examples, 100% male. And then at Belcara at Tsleil-Waututh as well, too, marked bias towards male chum. Now, why would people overharvest male chum? Well, the key, there's several reasons why people would do that. One of which is that if you pull more males out of the system, the remaining males can still mate with all the females. So you can pull a large proportion of the males out, and the remaining males will still mate with the females successfully and provide as many salmon for the next year as would have been the case otherwise. Also, the males are bigger. There's more meat on them, and they don't have as much egg and body cavity. So people, if they need to take in 1,000 salmon, they might have well targeted the males, because the effort put into males results in more caloric output for that effort. Now, if we just look at what these two look like, right, they look fairly similar until they start to spawn. And then when the male chum approach the fresh water, they get this funny red color, they get a big hook in the nose, and they're blacker on top. So they're quite visually distinctive, right? So in this context, you can imagine individuals set up at fish traps or weirs spanning the rivers or intertidal fish traps, and selectively harvesting the males because they can see them. They could selectively spear them, they could selectively net them, or as they're entrapped, they could selectively release the females and harvest the males. Now, if we look at our 4 sites that I've emphasized here, I said 2 of these have this bias towards males and 2 do not. I've done some basic statistics here too. So the binomial values for these 2 sites, DHR6 and DHR22, are statistically significant, right? So very, very low chance that this is a sampling error, and much more likely that it's actually reflecting real differences between these populations. And so we're left with this interesting situation, right? Unlike chum, where everyone's clearly harvesting all predominantly chum in Burrard Inlet, not everybody is selectively harvesting male chum in Burrard Inlet. We've got excellent evidence for it at 2 locations and no evidence for it at 2 essentially adjacent locations. So our working hypothesis here is that individuals who lived at those 2 settlements where the evidence displays a marked bias towards male chum, that those individuals had access, whether it's ownership rights or stewardship rights, to fish traps and weirs, perhaps on the Indian River, perhaps other streams. And those people were managing these stocks. They were observing the returns year after year, season after season, and selectively harvesting to maintain a healthy stock. Conversely, I think the people living at these two other settlements where they're not selectively harvesting are probably were not able to access those major fish weirs and fish traps, and were probably harvesting chum wherever they could get them, small streams, small creeks, ditches, you name it, but certainly showing no evidence of this bias towards male harvesting. And so what does this ancient DNA teach us from salmon teach us about pre-contact indigenous fisheries on Burrard Inlet? Well, first and foremost, this fishery is completely dominated by chum salmon. And I think that stands in contrast to how most archaeologists have thought about salmon fishing and the intensification of salmon fishing through time. If you read the literature, you'll note that it's absolutely replete with focus on sockeye, people on the Fraser River. But that's certainly not what we see here. So what we've also learned that at some of these settlements, there's a sex selective fishery focused on male chums that we think is probably linked to weir ownership and of course status. We've learned that these ancestral Tsleil-Waututh settlements in Eastern Burrard Inlet are not winter settlements. They're occupied essentially year-round by at least some segment of the population. And we identify no change whatsoever in these fishing strategies. So for over 2,000 years, we see people targeting the same resources at about the same proportions through time. So this is evidence of a very stable, sustainable fishery. I'm not sure any more than 2,000 years. I'm not sure what duration we need to sort of get this concept of stability. You know, if this was a very unstable fishery, what I would expect to see is rapid switching between different species, or some settlements focusing on some species and some on others. But that's absolutely not what we see. We see stability and we see similarity for 2 millennia here. And at the beginning, I said I would try to have some implications for modern fisheries management. You know, I'm getting out of my wheelhouse here a little bit, but certainly from my perspective and my research, it seems that these stream and intertidal intercept fisheries, when fish are close to their natal streams, appear to have been exceedingly sustainable, right? We were talking about supporting populations of thousands of people, you know, lineages that existed for thousands of years based on discrete ownership of discrete sites, you know, lineages who managed those resources, observed them year after year, season after season, to ensure future benefit for their generations. These facilities are monitored as well, right? This is something that would exist in your front yard. You would see it every day. Perhaps you're out there twice a day, every single day. You're repairing the netting, you're repairing your traps, you're pulling out the species that you don't want, and you're seeing what's in there. It's that sort of very intimate local knowledge that I think is incomparable in terms of both the information that's extracted and maintained within the sort of cultural consciousness of these people compared to fisheries records and stock counts at particular paces at particular locations. And finally, I guess in terms of for modern fisheries management, if we replicate what worked in the past, then perhaps we can move forward a little bit. So perhaps if Tsleil-Waututh or other First Nations are in need of extracting more chum from their existing stocks without damaging future stocks, perhaps sex-selective fisheries in the future are worth being considered or moving towards. And finally, I guess I'd just like to say thank you again for my First Nations friends for allowing me to do this research in their territory and undertaking this research on their ancestors and their ancestors' garbage, and leave you with a picture here again, overlooking Comox Harbor or Pentlatch Harbor, with Quinish, the white whale, in the background on top of the glacier, which is of course the symbol behind Comox's white whale there on the upper right hand. So with that, I think I will stop, and I will stop sharing my screen, and we can take some questions.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for a really great talk, and for keeping on time to leave us lots of space for questions. So I will be monitoring the chat box, but and call on whoever has already posted a question. But if you have any questions otherwise, you're also free to raise your hand and then we'll come to you. So Andrea Reed had a first question for you, so I will let her ask that question. Are you able to unmute? Okay, sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Colette. This was a great talk. I really enjoyed listening to what you've been working on. The question I put in the chat was just, I'm curious to know if and how this aligns with oral histories of Comox as well as contemporary understandings and perceptions in the community and beyond, and if there's been work in this space already done. Thanks.
That question was geared specifically towards the Comox fish trap panels, Andrea? Or...
Yeah, but I guess it could apply more broadly to the whole of the work, just if there's kind of that intention to unite it or cross-validate it.
Sure. So absolutely, there is ethnographic evidence of Coast Salish people and other Northwest Coast people of selectively harvesting male chump. And in some cases, they're explicit of why they do so. And yeah, they're bigger, they're meatier, there's more of them. And in my mind, this information's been out there for 100 years, and the archaeology validates it in one way. And it's not that the ethnographic information is any lower than the archaeological information or vice versa. It's just when they're both completely independent and coming to the same conclusion, that conclusion is just all the stronger. So certainly the archaeology in this case validates or confirms the ethnographic descriptions of this activity. And in the Comox case, we moved to the fish trap panel. The oral history held amongst the elders there that shared with me, they were all certain those were used for catching salmon. So some of the other research, herring, perhaps, 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years is a long time in the sort of oral consciousness, right? So absolutely, the use of the panel, that location, it confirms what had been told by elders for a long time, that those were used for catching salmon, not for herring.
Thank you, Jesse. Diane, I think you have your hand raised, so you can go next.
Yes, I did. Hi, Jesse. I'm Diane Newell, and I'm very fascinated, particularly with the Comox research. I'd never seen anything quite like that, and the volume of catch, the size of the catch would be incredible. Of course, for every one of those salmon, you would have to be also processing and storing, and much of it was probably traded. So there's a big story there, even behind what you're doing. When I first saw the ribs of lathe in the mud, I was thinking they were, they were just the, what do you call it, the ramp for canoes. And of course, you've got such a big story now to go with that as well. It's fascinating to me. But I think it's really important to remember about the trade side of that volume of catch, and especially the processing, which does apply to the Fraser as well, to Burrard Inlet as well, because I've always thought that the selection of fall fishery was important in the seasonal round, because there is a seasonal round of serious berry picking and stripping of bark and other things, particularly the women were doing and not available for the processing. And I think some of that is a very sophisticated strategy that's connected to the seasonal round. But the DNA analysis is going to really be so important. It's lovely to see that early work. And Camilla is also associated with the Fisheries IOF, and so I could see, hopefully, maybe more, seeing more of both of you in the future, and hearing about the work. Thank you so much. No question in there.
Thank you, Diane. I think Deng, you had a question, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was a particular vernacular name that it's used for harvested males that would distinguish them from the rest of the population and from released females, because the vernacular names would be very interesting to input into FishBase.
That's a very interesting question. There is not, to my knowledge, there is not, but that does not reflect much of anything. I am not a fluent Hunkaminam speaker, and I only have minimal exposure. So I think I will pass that on to the more experienced language folks, or maybe other archaeologists who are more actively involved day to day with fisheries and pulling the guts out and stuff like that. But that's nothing that I can't answer that. I can certainly say they would recognize them. It's absolutely indistinguishable. They're absolutely distinguishable. And the oral histories too describe going to the land of the chum salmon people, and some were all wearing red and some were all wearing black, right? People are absolutely aware which the males were and which the females were, and it would be shocked if they didn't have different names for them. I just don't know them.
It is particularly for the harvested males, because I was thinking that maybe there is a trade name for them as well. So it's, but yeah, I'm interested in common names, and this is why I would really appreciate if there was a feedback for that information. Thank you.
I know that is a super cool question, actually. Ian, I know you typed out your question, but if you would like me to read it out, I'm happy to do so. Otherwise, please go ahead and take the mic.
Hey, Jesse, and so great to see this highlighted, and what amazing work you guys are engaged in on two different sides of the Salish Sea, and wanted to just congratulate you on that. And wondering if you could speak more to the flexibility of this latticework fence that you uncovered as it would be moving up and down the harbor with the tide, and just the role of the stake alignments versus the fence. And then secondly, just looking at all of the zooarchaeological data from existing collections from Comox, there's 95% of those fisheries assemblages are composed of herring, yet salmon is such a neat focus. So is there any work on sort of tracking that transition in the faunas from your work with Comox? So.
Thank you, Ian. Good to see you again. So to answer the last part of your question, that is my next research priority with Comox. And so we're going to put some plans together, and we're going to make it awesome and figure it all out. But it's going to take us a couple of years. Moving to the logistics of those panels, we suffer from really bad winter storms here that pick up around November. And I'm talking, regular 80-kilometer-hour winds, giant logs being tossed around, and it's driven from the southeast, which feed into the harbor. So people would have had to disassemble these panels off the wooden stakes. Those stakes stay there forever, right? They've been there for 1,300 years, and some of them are still there. These panels would have to be disassembled. So I imagine those big catamaran-style 2 canoes with some planks between, people disassembling them, moving them off, and then bringing them back into their big houses, or perhaps a giant storage shed or something. Like I said, you need 80 panels for one trap. And some of these traps consist of 3 segments reaching farther into the intertidal. So then we're getting to 240 panels for one trap, right? So in my mind, this is something that's owned and managed by a lineage, right? You've got a big house group who owns that stuff. You've got a fish trap manager who knows how to build that stuff, when those panels come out and how to attach them. And then you've got this huge storage shed or house full of these panels. So it's an immense amount of effort. And also think for a second on the forestry implications here. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of individual trees that are cut down at 12 years old and pounded into the mud, right? So we're talking hectares and hectares and hectares of Douglas fir trees that are selectively managed, harvested out of here, floated down, and driven into the muck. So it's a really big undertaking, right? It's not the sort of thing 2 guys get together and do in an afternoon. This is something that a lineage does together with hundreds of years worth of cumulative knowledge, with ownership of those locations, and the detailed knowledge of how to put that together.
I just want to add a thought to that, if I can. Just one of the big tasks I could imagine sending the kids out to do in the afternoon is to make sure there's no driftwood hanging around and damaging further those features. So wonderful to think about the vibrancy of that. Thanks.
And just as a final comment, those features are everywhere. I've walked up and down those beaches, scratching my head, saying, if I was coming in with a canoe, how would I get my canoe into this village, right? I can see wooden elements everywhere. And there must have been little passageways somewhere, but the traps are so extensive here, it's hard to imagine approaching these villages by water. But we know they had to. It's just that scale of density.
Thanks. Matt, you're next.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering if there are any recent examples, indigenous fisheries or non-indigenous fisheries, that are sex selective, if you know of any, or if anyone, I guess, on the call knows of any.
They still do it.
Thank you.
My understanding, Coast Salish people have continued, we've got it recorded in the past, and I know Chehalis, my understanding is Chehalis people still do this currently for that reason, that the males are bigger, less work, you get more meat out of it. There's several lines of logic as why would people would do that, but certainly it seems to be ongoing to my knowledge. If Morgan Ritchie is on the call here, he's a co-author on one of these papers here. He could perhaps speak to that if he's willing.
Hey, I'm here.
Right.
I didn't track the question carefully enough to be able to answer it very well, but people in Chehalis, where I work, are continuing to. Oh, sorry, there's lots of background noise. Maybe this is not the best time for me to try to address the question. I think they're singing a birthday video in the background. Maybe Jesse, you got it. You know all this stuff.
So they do. They continue on as far as we were, and it's probably more extensive than we're aware. We're just not asking the right questions of the right people.
Thank you. Andrew, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Jesse. I've got a couple of questions, and it's really related more to the remains in the digs. In terms of sizes, the thing with males is that you get precocious males coming back. You can get jacks. And so unlike females, you can get really small males and really big males, depending on the ages. And I can see if you ultimately go for just big males, you could end up messing with management in the sense of getting too many small males becoming your breeders. So I'm wondering, one way to look at this might be to measure the otoliths that you've been recovering and actually construct the size distribution for males and females to get a bit more insight into size selectivity. So I don't know if you've done that, if it's primarily otoliths you're working with.
No, it's vertebrate, and we recover otoliths relatively rarely, I would say. But the other method that archaeologists have done is to X-ray the vertebrae, and you sort of get that annual ring effect, and then you can identify its chum. You can see whether it spawned at 4 years or 3 years. I think we actually did X-ray all our vertebrae as well. I can't remember the results whatsoever. But I see your logic. If you have a bias targeted sample towards the largest of the fish, then perhaps you're going to shift towards smaller over time. I would like to see that. I think we could probably explore that genetically as well too. I don't know if there's a genetic marker for jacking, like if you can pick that up as a marker. But our next stage with this research is whole genome sequencing of these remains.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, it'd be another element to explore. And my second question was in terms of the mammal fauna, the mix between terrestrial and marine, and to the extent to which there was also a terrestrial diet and the importance of that in that particular area, in the Burrard Inlet.
So if we look at the larger mammal fauna, I would guesstimate it's probably probably a slight bias towards the large land-based mammal fauna over seals and sea lions, but it's probably quite close. If we look at the isotopic signature of the human remains themselves, though, they're very consistent that people are getting about 95% of their protein from marine sources. So for every deer you eat, you're going to eat 100 or 1,000 salmon. So it's certainly the land resources are important, but completely overshadowed in terms of the protein, especially. I assume you're getting a lot of berries and roots and other sort of carbs from your land-based sources, but your diet is completely dominated by marine sources. In Comox, in Burrard Inlet, everywhere you go in coastal British Columbia.
Great. Thanks so much.
Billy, you have your hand up, so please take it away.
All right. Jess, I'm going to talk about fisheries. I hope that's okay with you. I'm sure it is, yeah. And I'm showing you this. I grew up in the northern part of Denmark, a fishing village, and at the beach we had these nets. They went perpendicular out from the coast for about 300, 400, 500 meters. They didn't actually look like this all the way. They looked more like this. So poles, and in between you see those nets, or not nets, lines hanging down. Now they are for fishing for pelagic fish, mainly mackerel and herring, the occasional salmon, and it was quite a widespread fishery. So I think you should include herring in your list of species that are caught with these gears, noting also that down at Steveston in the winter months, January, February, March, there are big herring coming in all the way up the river, going out again with the tides, and no reason to believe it shouldn't be the same at Comox, giving all the herring populations up in that part of the strait. So that would be my addition for the species caught by these gears.
I agree. And you know that the proof is in the refuse, right? We've got these giant Shellmen where people discarding this stuff. And as Ian mentioned, herring outnumbers salmon 1,000 to 1 everywhere we dig, if we sample properly. So there's a lot more herring than there is salmon everywhere we look in Comox as well, right? So I believe you entirely. I saw a similar fish trap like that in the Lagoon of Venice just 2 years ago, right? These technologies work really, really well. And people have used them repeatedly discovered them independently and used them all over the world. And perhaps, especially with these smaller fish, it might be the most effective way to get them in large numbers.
Well, my grandfather was running that kind of gears, and they actually occasionally got caught bluefin tuna in them as well. But that was absolutely a bycatch. They are very labor intensive, as you point out, and they really have to, every day they have to be looked after, otherwise they're lost. And I would like to thank Jesse very much, and indeed I would like to thank all the 90 participants in this seminar for showing up here. Thank you very much, Jesse.